To pick up 4 or 5, I guess, big points. The first one, of course, is that for people working in the sector, our fundamental challenge still remains. We have to be able to transpose the urban or urbanization or cities, or whichever way you look at it, from the realm of being a challenge to an opportunity. That project has just begun. And I think that's going to be the fundamental challenge that we have over this plan in the next few years. The evidence that we've heard speaks to 2 or 3 important things. One, of course, is there's tremendous dynamism and there's a lot of things happening. There's a lot of innovation happening. However, and with this growth, it's moderately clear that as far as urban India is concerned, poverty is increasing, inequality is increasing, there's a deepening of exclusion, and interestingly now you have new evidence to say that this is also happening on traditional lines. So we have some fundamental challenges that we have to address, and we're reaching a point now with Gini potentially touching point 4, etc., that we have to start looking at it from a national perspective, politically and otherwise. This is accompanied with 2 things that are of great concern. One is the crisis of work, and we've heard that talked about very sort of eloquently in many subsections. And of course, the thing that's really bothering is both the informalization and the casualization, and it's a structural challenge that we're facing as far as that's concerned. The second thing is that there's a huge land market failure, and we've been sort of head in the sand on this thing now for 40 or 50 years because Bombay's been happening for a long time. It's not like happened yesterday. So that has to be addressed very critically. It has an impact on the macroeconomy. It has an impact on our political system, and obviously has an impact on where our cities are going to grow and how it's going to grow. So that has to be sort of frontally addressed. And it's interesting that the discussion is opened on property rights and titling and entitlements around that. But if you don't deal with that, the linkage between the political economy and the operational reality of dealing with inequity and poverty will not be possible to deal with. Having said that, our ability to mobilize around this question, whether it's at the community level or even within government, and also I would say even politically, is not as much as one would have expected at this point of time. So there needs to be spaces created for that mobilization to actually happen, and this is across all these different actors. And I think the reason why this discussion is actually very interesting is because it provides the beginning of those spaces. And I'll start with one critical thing, and that is, if the political class or political mobilization doesn't happen, this won't actually work. And in that sense, I think there is a big project to engage with, because in all my discussions with people in both Parliament and with the legislatures, this imagination of India as it might be and as it is still a fundamental issue, and you have to take that forward. And to pick up on the judicial question, I would include the judiciary as part of that challenge, because at the moment, given our system, our common law system, the judiciary is doing as much legislation and setting precedent almost as Parliament is, especially as Parliament is becoming less and less has not been engaging very much in this question. So that's a serious challenge. And we put up the slide yesterday. It really is something that deals with about 5 to 10,000 people. But we have to engage with that in a very concrete way, because unless that moves, things don't happen. And once that happens, and I would imagine there are 2 or 3 things that need to be addressed. There's the entitlement question that has to be addressed both theoretically and practically. Then obviously the service question, the linkage between jobs, land, so where people work, where they live, and how they earn their livelihoods and how surplus is generated is very important. Because what we are finding is that surplus generation, which is the basis on which cities function, is actually being seriously challenged. So there's lots of people doing a lot of work, but the surplus formation is both skewed, and we're actually demolishing and constraining that as far as poor people are concerned.
Very briefly, to summarize, that when we talk about inclusion, who are we including? And we are talking about the vulnerable urban populations. We're not talking about the old style poverty line, or what is now being considered as the poverty line. So these include the working poor in the urban informal economy, the informal settlements, people living in informal settlements who have lack of basic services, and the socially vulnerable. I think what we tried to talk about was the inclusion in cities. What is the vision, which we spent quite a bit of time talking about the vision and the negative vision both. What works, what practically works, and what are some of the things that can be done. Employment came up as a very strong issue, and today also the occupational vulnerability is perhaps the most significant identification. And how can you be, what does inclusion in employment mean? Many, many different issues came up, including, I think, which I feel very strongly about, is the exclusion of manufacturing. The second point that came up a lot was housing, and especially basic infrastructure, water and sanitation, and a move towards in situ regularization, giving property rights through in situ, basic infrastructure in situ, and delinking it perhaps from the complete property right. The third thing was the social services and the basic needs. So social services, when we talk about that, it's basically the provision of schooling and health. And yesterday we heard about a possibility of social development zones being part of the ROI and the development of slums. But there are major questions which we did not go into, but which were touched upon on the provision of schooling and education. Then there's the whole issue of social protection, which has a variety of schemes already under it. Perhaps the biggest one is the public distribution system. One thing that came out very strongly was the identity and recognition. And then, of course, was the issue of voice, community-based organizations influencing policies, letting their needs be known. And finally, I saw it very strongly in Amarnath's presentation, which was the public resources. When DDA and the MCD, etc., own 75% of the land where people are living, then how is that public resource used? So there is a lot of public resource which is owned by government agencies. And can that be equitably used? Can it be a common resource in some way, can be used for the poor?
Ravi and Jessica's presentation made the point very interesting, very clearly. There was a graph which showed allocations for rural areas and allocations for urban areas from the Planning Commission. And rural was totally on the left, very high, and urban on the right towards, I mean, I forget how much it was, but it's enormous. So clearly India has to correct this imbalance, because the future of India is not in the rural areas, it is in the urban areas. That's where employment will be generated, GDP will be generated, wealth will be generated, and depending how India meets this challenge, means prosperity and welfare for many people, or the opposite. As Bimal Patel's perspective on urban planning were extremely powerful and extremely important, and India needs a revolution in urban planning. And I don't want to offend the engineers, but it has to be taken away from the engineers, and it has to be given to people who can think more in system and social system, in the dynamics of social systems. The Joint Secretary, Ray Aruna Sundaraj, I think was very reassuring that Ray, at least for the time being, is taking a very clear position that the response to slum is not to move them away from the city, it's not to put them in towers, but it is to rehabilitate slums. And we do hope that the Ray program will follow and be able to cut across vested interests and bad ideas to remain faithful to its original goal. Bijal Bhatt made very compelling and very interesting reviews of what slum development could be. This is also important along with Marco Ferrario's experiences in different slums. I think these are very valuable experiences. As well, Patricia's point on the economics of land in urban areas is something that is at the heart of all that we're discussing, at the heart of the mismanagement of cities, the sprawl of cities horizontally, the cost, the loss of economics of agglomeration, and so on and so forth. And ultimately, everybody pays, not only the poor, but also the middle class. It's a very fundamental point.
I wonder whether, if we were doing this again, we would talk more about cities from the perspective of women and girls. I think that's something that's been touched on quite a lot, but I'm a bit surprised in talking about inclusive cities that the gender perspective doesn't make it on your list in a way. But I think we have seen the opportunities. I think we've seen the opportunities in the openness of all participants for discussing some of these challenging issues, including the government openness to discuss issues around their schemes. And finally, just to make one comment that I made at the beginning, I do hope we keep in mind, it's often quite easy to think about this in terms of the larger cities, and we've talked a lot about Delhi today, but this is in the agenda of how it affects some of our smaller cities with lower capacity for dealing with some of these issues is something we must also keep very much in our minds. So thank you very much for such a rich discussion.